Welcome back to the Political Risk Podcast, where geopolitics and specialty insurance markets meet. You're listening to a new special episode produced in association with Liberty Specialty Markets. The theme is war and terrorism, taking an integrated approach to claims and underwriting. I'm your host, David Benyon, and I'm joined by two guests from LSM, together representing claims and underwriting for war, political violence and terrorism business. Sarah Howell is head of first-party claims. Sarah leads the first-party claims team at Liberty Specialty Markets, which consists of more than 25 claims specialists. She has more than 2 decades of experience managing high-value and complex international claims, with several years in leadership roles within the insurance industry. Jennie Beard is underwriting manager for war and terrorism. She's the underwriting manager for the war and terrorism account in London at LSM, leading a team of 8 underwriters. Jennie manages a globally diverse portfolio of political violence and terrorism risks and brings over 2 decades of experience within the class of business. The conversation begins with an overview of LSM's political violence portfolio. Sarah and Jennie then explain the role that close coordination plays between underwriting and claims teams in a swift and coherent response to geopolitical crises. Discussion turns to LSM's claims response to live conflict, particularly the Russia-Ukraine war. As this episode was recorded on exactly the 4-year anniversary of the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the pair also discussed the creation of a Lloyd's Market Association claims coordination group for war and terrorism, designed to improve collaboration across the market during large-scale loss events. The word collaboration is used several times in the conversation, describing the LMA claims and underwriting groups. Of course, this collaboration requires that client-sensitive or confidential information is not shared at those meetings, and collaboration to the extent that it's permissible from a competition law perspective. Finally, the episode explores how trends observed in the conduct of warfare and lessons gained from recent conflicts, including Ukraine, Israel, Sudan, and Mozambique, feed back into underwriting and claims strategy. So why is this episode different, and why is it important? Well, I think the focus on claims leadership at LSM, integrated alongside underwriting teams, is something we don't often hear enough about, but from a client's perspective, it demonstrates insurers doing what they're supposed to do. This episode also showcases a positive example of London market collaboration at LMA level, to the Claims Coordination Group for War and Terrorism. I think crisis management lessons learned for the market from the Ukraine war, as it turns 4 years old, may be particularly useful given the latest crisis in the Middle East, as the US and Israel are now at war with Iran, in a conflict which has already widened regionally with Iranian retaliation against the Gulf monarchies, with global consequences already being felt. Just a reminder that this episode was recorded on February the 24th, so that's 4 days before the US strikes on Iran that began the conflict that's now taking place in the Gulf, so don't expect these very latest events to be referred to in the conversation. Okay, that's plenty for me. Let's get into it. Jennie, Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, David.
Jennie, let's start with you then. So you lead war and terrorism underwriting at Liberty Specialty Markets. Can you outline the scope of the portfolio, how it fits within Liberty's global product lines, and how exposed this class has been to all the geopolitical volatility we see all around us in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. Liberty's been in this line of business pretty much since World Trade Center, so we were one of the founding syndicates, and we're very much a lead market in this class. I think the differentiator for Liberty is that we are a global product line, and so therefore we have about 30 underwriters globally writing this class of business. I'm lucky enough to manage the London portfolio, which consists of 8 underwriters. Personally, I've written the class for 20 years now. The team in London have over 45 years worth of experience in this. So we've seen many events over that period. The portfolio in London is very diverse. It covers everything from terrorism, sabotage, riot, strike, civil commotion, political violence, and then the full sort of cross-border war perils as well. Geographies, we write everywhere in the world. We have quite a broad appetite base in terms of occupancy and asset classes that we consider, ranging from airports, retail, real estate, energy assets. We write on company and Lloyd's paper, predominantly on Lloyd's, and we've got a $250 million line which we deploy quite regularly. It's one of the largest Lloyd's carriers in the market for this line of business. As I've mentioned, this is a specialist line of business. It requires a lot of technical expertise and a lot of knowledge around what current affairs are and what goes on in geopolitical environments around the world. Of recent years, particularly referring sort of post-Ukraine era, so it's 4 years, unfortunately, since that conflict began, to the day. Yeah. So, the portfolio is exposed to a huge amount of volatility, and that volatility increases year on year. There's probably no area of the world that hasn't been touched by geopolitical instability, whether or not that's Latin America, USA, and then Ukraine and Middle East. And even today, I've come in and we're thinking about what's going on with the unrest in Mexico at the moment and how we look at that event. And what's really come to the forefront of our mind as this volatility increases is the importance of the Liberty message of long-term client relationships, stability, disciplined underwriting, that strong accumulation management, and that integration with our claims when events are unfolding. So it's a real team effort.
I've spoken to quite a few different parts of the team around the globe. I remember talking to Rafiq in Dubai a couple of years back, and a level or two up Mike Burl here in London, but also Francois in Paris and Björn in Germany.
Indeed, people I speak to all day, every day. So we're a very joined up global product line. So we clear each risk, we discuss each asset that comes in that touches different regions, because locally they have insights that maybe London don't have and vice versa. So it's very much a joined up global product line.
And I think that's going to be a theme for this episode, talking about being joined up, both within the firm, but also collaboratively around the market. Let's turn to you, Sarah. So, Sarah, you rejoined Liberty just before the Ukraine war began, and you've been instrumental since then in coordinating the claims response. Could you explain your current role as head of first-party claims, the structure of the team around you, and how you see PV and war claims sitting within the broader claims framework?
Yeah, absolutely. So my current role is leading a team of 26 people who are very experienced from a technical standpoint, handling all first-party lines of business. Historically, and when I rejoined Liberty, these political violence losses have been handled within our marine claims team. And my background's on the property side of the industry. So I saw an opportunity really to kind of put a property lens over this and really focus on event response. So, from a property standpoint, obviously that would be predominantly natural disaster type events that we'd be managing as a business, looking at our exposures and then deploying teams of experts to manage those losses. So when we realised that we were leading on a number of large losses as a result of this event, we decided to deploy a similar setup. So as mentioned, we have a team of 26, very experienced in lots of different lines of business. And the way we now look at political violence and war and terrorism within that first party team is we ensure that we have industry experts. So if we have an energy loss, which is a political violence claim, we'd look to have an energy claims handler involved or handling that claim.
Integration is clearly crucial to all of this, and it's probably the core of this whole conversation, as I say, collaboration and integration within underwriting and claims teams working closely together. So whichever one of you wants to begin, but to both of you, how does that work in practice when an event breaks in this space? What are some of those first conversations internally, and who gets involved from day one?
So Liberty have got a business model called an integrated business unit, which has kind of been in effect for a couple of years now and has been really successful. And what it does, it pulls all various business functions into one integrated unit so that everyone is supporting each other. So claims, underwriting, exposure management, actuarial, finance, we all have conversations whilst in the same room, and that's really changed the dial for us. So the integration between ourselves and claims really does come into life when we see an event happening. Day one, underwriting claims, we need to be in the same conversation. Sarah and her team need to know what our exposures are. So number one, first thing that will happen is we understand the impact of that event, what that looks like to Liberty. So we immediately go and ask for our exposures from our exposure management team. So part of that IBU, they're run pretty much within hours, I would say. But then we start thinking about what the likely claims output is. So I referred to the events in Mexico earlier. I've already sent a list of insureds over to Sarah so that she's got that kind of advanced view of what we could be looking at within the portfolio within London. And then, interestingly, on the war side of things, we've had over the last few years, we've introduced something called the War Committee, which is multiple lines within Liberty that write war business. So whether or not that's marine, aviation, political risks and terrorism, we all get in the same room and collaboratively kind of share ideas about what that impact could look like in terms of the conflict and what messaging we need to send upwards to management. And then it hands over to, claims, exposure management, and then leadership, so that we're aligned on communication and strategy going forward, so that our brokers know the strategy, and then obviously we can pass over to claims.
Just to kind of connecting up the dots on the claim side. So once we've got that information, we're then in a position, regardless of class of business, to reach out to broking partners and ask them if they've been notified. Often the way things are conventionally done would be for brokers to notify us once claims come in. But we're now armed with that information as where we know there could be exposure, to be able to reach out to brokers and ask if there's anything we can do to support instructing experts. So we're kind of on the front foot and able to manage those losses, as they start to evolve.
Okay, so looking at claims response to live conflicts, so we'll focus next section on innovation, coordination, and some lessons learned. So Sarah, you've described PV as property with a different peril. What does that realisation mean in operational terms?
I think we just put a different lens on the way we categorise these losses. And as I mentioned earlier, sort of coming at this from a property standpoint, very, very sophisticated class of business with lots of many years of experience of handling large losses. So we were able to come at this from a perspective of this really truly is property with a different peril, particularly in this instance where we're essentially dealing with war on land. But what's very different is obviously this is not going to be a conventional adjustment process. This is going to be extremely challenging. So we were looking at this from a perspective of, okay, we need to ensure we've got the experts in place who are going to seek out solutions to give us that information. So that's what made it a little bit different. That might be similar to, after a major hurricane or earthquake or wildfire. It's a really challenging situation to deal with, but you've got an active conflict ongoing in some instances at our insured premises. So it's really kind of looking at this from a perspective of how do we manage these large losses. And yes, the policy wordings are somewhat different because of the peril, but we have very experienced leaders within our team who are used to adapting and applying their knowledge to the circumstances in front of them. I think it's really coming at this from a perspective of if you've got an experienced property claims handler who's equipped with managing large, complex losses in the aftermath of a major natural disaster, for example, they're equipped with knowing how to find solutions. Those are the individuals who are really focused around moving claims forward, used to dealing with really large losses, used to dealing with multiple different experts, which we've had to in losses of this nature. It's really, really critical to have multiple different experts where needed. So you get that technical expertise and then you can build on a framework. So you've got supporting documentation to ensure that when you're making payments, when you're finalising a loss, you have that information available. So I think property with a different peril is probably the best way to describe political violence, particularly the types of losses we at Liberty were dealing with arising from the conflict in the Ukraine.
Yeah, so when Russia invaded Ukraine 4 years ago, what changed in how you handled claims compared with how this was done historically?
We knew immediately this was going to be a significant event for the London market. We knew we were leading on a number of the larger losses arising from the event, and that we had to deploy a really clear method of managing these large losses. As Jennie mentioned earlier, this is a global product. So from a London standpoint, we also helped coordinate the losses that arose from our Paris office and our Dubai office as well. So we really were instrumental in sort of pulling together the exposures that the business had. And then in terms of driving forward our lead losses, we knew it was critical to get that excellent team in place from day one, which, we'll talk about later, but really made a tremendous difference in this instance.
Yeah, I mean, it gets more fascinating, I think, the more you get into this, more granular. So because access in a live war zone is understandably very limited. So how have you used those different sources, open source intelligence, or satellite imagery, or social media or other tools to assess damage and causation? And how has that enabled Liberty to conclude claims and essentially pay significant sums in a timely manner?
We used all of those methods to help us build on the ability to essentially pay significant sums. I'm very proud to say that, as a business, I believe, were one of the first, if not the first, to make a large payment on account on the Ukraine losses arising. That was predominantly down to having an adjustment team who were really clear on finding solutions using social media. So we had one instance where we had a Russian reporter who was recording and interviewing some of the Russian soldiers.
On Telegram.
On Telegram, yeah, correct. And it wasn't of interest to us what she was speaking about in her interviews. It was more about what we could see in the background. In one instance, it was our insured's property. Then we could see, where there had been missile damage. And then that enabled us to understand, okay, using the operational team from the insured's side, we knew exactly what was within that building. So using that information enabled us to move the adjustment process forward. So, it's having a team of adjusters who are willing to go the extra mile and really seek out every opportunity to find information. And social media can be a good platform for that.
And then I assume you've got satellite imagery as well, so you can see an aerial view of the same building, the roof from above or what's left of it.
Yeah, satellite imagery can be a really useful tool to enable us to determine exactly when the damage occurred as well, which obviously is really critical from ensuring that damage occurs within our policy period. That's vital that we have that information, not just for us, but also for follow markets and for reinsurers as well. It's really important that we have that information. Satellite imagery is a great way for us to be able to do that.
There's an LMA claims coordination group for war and terrorism that you led the creation of that group. What's been the story there and why was it needed?
Going back to sort of the point I made earlier, my background's from the property side of the industry. So I've for many years sat on the property insurance claims group, which was, coordinated by the LMA. So my first question to my manager at the time was, is there a PV version of this group? So we reached out to the LMA and found out that there wasn't. But they were excellent at essentially helping us to then create a group for exactly that. So the property group would be used significantly in the aftermath of a major event that the market is wrangling its way through. We needed that for political violence and terrorism, and really pleased that the LMA supported us with that. It's a real selling point, I think, for the Lloyd's market. That collaboration, that knowledge sharing that we have within those LMA committee groups is really, really beneficial.
Yeah, and having a template there already. I mean, I know from talking to, on the marine war side of things, for example, you've got the Joint War Committee that the LMA chairs. So, yeah, Neil there does it, Neil Roberts. So it's kind of very handy having that mechanism in place where you can use it across different lines of business, and you've got an organisation there which can represent the different stakeholders in the market.
Yeah, and there's a great amount of knowledge sharing, and the group now meets quarterly and it has grown significantly in the last 4 years.
I think also from an underwriting perspective, I sit on the LMA panel for the PVT side. From the underwriting perspective, and it's useful as the claims coordination group has come together, we now have a representative attend that meeting and kind of give some feedback loop into what could impact the underwriting side as the market wrangles with these things. So I'm not just hearing from the Liberties claim side of things, we're hearing from a broader perspective of people as well. It has been very, very useful for the market, I think.
So Sarah, a question for you. So what sensitivities have you found exist around information security and market communication in the context you were just talking about? And how has that collaboration improved outcomes, whether it's for the insured or across lead and following markets?
Yeah, so any large loss, the lead claims handler will be hosting market meetings, sharing information with the follow market, and losses of this nature. All of the leaders have done exactly that. It's really, really critical to share that information. And we hosted regular in-person market meetings. You're absolutely right. The information can be quite sensitive. The focus around doing those meetings in person, I think, also helps the follow market to understand how we've got to where we are, why we're recommending payment on account at this level, because we're able to present in conjunction with the adjusting team exactly how we've got to where we are. So there are challenges for this class of business, I think that's fair to say. We try our best to manage those very sensitively.
And I guess it's a case of what goes around comes around, isn't it, too? Because on one risk you may lead and another one not. So, it's building that trust.
Absolutely. And there's a significant amount of that within this class of business. There's, tremendous trust put in within the leaders and a lot of support from follow market, which is very important.
For terrorism business, you get blast zones, but this is a very different context when it's a missile strike in Ukraine. In the same way as you were saying earlier about, some of these structures exist, but in other lines of business, and you've just got to bring them across. And it's always a kind of, it's incremental gains, but, you kind of step by step build things out, and that's how you improve things.
Yeah, and I think when you've got a method and a mechanism of doing things for next time, I mean, hopefully we're not dealing with another situation like this, but if we were, I feel very confident that we'd run a very similar process, and we feel confident knowing that we can manage these losses efficiently, which is really, really important.
We'll move the focus now to feeding some claims lessons back into underwriting and modelling as well. So Jennie, looking at events since Ukraine, but also including events in Israel post 7th of October and losses in places maybe like Sudan, Mozambique as well, where we've seen some activity. How have some of the claims lessons reshaped your underwriting approach, particularly around accumulation control, location plotting, blast radius modelling, that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say Liberty, I've worked at 3 syndicates now, and accumulation modelling is taken extremely seriously here. Risks go on the system almost, immediately from the point of underwriting. So that's 101 underwriting for us, and was pre-Ukraine and continues to this day. What I think we've changed with some of our modelling, and we're always looking to evolve that kind of modelling, particularly on war risks. Sarah referred earlier to munitions experts that we used in the claim settlement process. We actually reached out to them when Israel happened, and we needed some context around what does a ballistic missile damage look like. And obviously it depends on the loading of the missile, etc., and what it actually hits. But we got some clear parameters of radiuses of what that sort of impact could look like. And therefore, we've used that in some of our Israeli war modelling to give us better context to the underwriting team. So we plot every location that we quote in Israel, and we look at that against the live portfolio, and we're very much looking at, what's the proximity to the next insured asset and what does that accumulation look like, so we're not overexposed in any one city or any one blast effectively. And that's been really useful. So we've used that in quite a lot of what I deem more hotspot zones where there is a huge amount of conflict activity at the moment. So we use it in Ukraine, we use it in Israel. But as different zones change, we're building that out into different territories as well, beyond looking at a city kind of damage. What has become apparent from these various conflicts that we've seen, and Sudan and Mozambique are no different, is I think combat tactics are changing. We're seeing a lot more drone activity around the world, and we need to be mindful of that in our underwriting. Physical security on the ground may be fine. What are we thinking about in terms of things like the Iron Dome? What kind of protections does the country have in terms of sort of aerial munitions? And that's definitely a consideration that we've had to contend with on the underwriting side since the Ukraine war. So we've lived through a lot of different events. As I say, Mozambique was quite an unrest conflict, and so therefore we've had to look at coverage regarding denial of access issues, etc. And so we're really honing those models now to ensure that we know exactly what the number is and what that exposure looks like.
It's fascinating, and as you say, the tactics and militaries, and whether it's terrorist organisations or conventional militaries are using, are changing, and Ukraine's obviously like a giant laboratory for innovation in that sense. And as you were saying, I just remember something I saw just the other day. In Myanmar, there was a Myanmar National Airlines passenger aircraft that was hit by suicide drones on the ground just the other day. And it goes to show that it's not just in Ukraine where drones have revolutionised the battlefield.
It has changed warfare. And I think as warfare evolves over the next 10 years, I don't expect warfare to look the same as it did 20 years ago. In 10 years' time, it's evolving quickly, and the market needs to adapt to ensure that coverage is in place for those things, and that underwriters are considering those changing and evolving risks.
So a question for both of you. When you're looking at tens of millions in payments on account across lead and follow markets, collaboration becomes critical. So how do you align brokers, followers and insureds to move more decisively when maintaining technical discipline at the same time on coverage and causation?
Well, this is something that we really focused on when dealing with these Ukraine losses in particular. So we had a scenario where in one situation, in just a matter of months, we were able to pay multiple tens of millions on accounts on one particular loss. So what was really important is, A, the broker was supporting us through that, and then we were working very closely with them at the time. But also, as I mentioned earlier, those in-person market meetings that we hosted with our follow market, they were all very, very supportive of us moving forward in that direction. Also, in-person meeting with the insurers. Fortunately, we were in a position to have many of those, and that helped them to understand what we were trying to do to help move the claim forward. And, cash flow could be really critical, particularly for a Ukrainian-based insured. We were able to move things forward in a really efficient manner and pay significant sums in the early stages. But communication, I guess, is the most important factor when, looking at making those big payments.
Yeah, I guess it's that initial costs of trying to keep business going in the first days after an event takes place.
Yeah. And with support from a really high caliber adjusting team, once we've got to a sort of undisputed or not less than number, Obviously we do often have compliance factors, sanctions, checks, etc., which can delay things a little bit. Fortunately, that didn't happen. We were able to make payments swiftly with support from the broker. And yeah, like you say, it's really essential that we get funds over to the insured as quickly as possible.
Okay, so a question for both of you. 4 years on from Ukraine, since the full-scale invasion, is the war and political violence market structurally different?
I don't think structurally it's hugely different. It went through a period of reflection, definitely after Ukraine. I think the more distressed or PV elements of the portfolios across market moved from facilities into the open market. Now, there were a number of factors on that, more down to underwriting discipline, reinsurance demand that happened. And then some carriers were reducing their PV aggregates in certain countries. Liberty took a different view. We take a very long-term view in terms of this line of business. And so we continued to trade through. We felt we understood the class and we wanted to provide those clients that capacity stability. I think our market is not in isolation, that, generally the insurance market is softening now. And so we are very much in a softening market, and that continues to decline despite all the geopolitical issues going on in the world. So, the yin and the yang don't quite go together. A paradox
we talk about quite a lot on this podcast.
But yeah, I think what's important for markets to remember here is the lessons that were learned post-Ukraine in terms of your accumulation reporting, your underwriting discipline. And it's important those lessons are remembered as we continue through this next cycle, because the world is not getting any easier. There's going to be more challenges coming at this class. But we need to stay focused and we need to, remember that to be here for the long term, discipline's important.
Do you think that the shocks of recent conflicts have made this class of business more organised, more disciplined in some ways, more risk aware? Or is it just down to being more technologically capable, going back to what you're saying about using different OSINT type data and tools and that kind of thing?
From my perspective, I think all of those. I think we as a market are probably now more confident in our ability to handle major events. I think we're more organised. The LMA group is probably a prime example of, from a claims standpoint, we're way more connected than the class of business used to be. We absolutely are more technologically capable. I think the confidence comes from knowing that 4 years ago, we were dealing with certain technologies to support us with the adjustment process. In 4 years' time, we may have even more. So I think it gives that confidence that using those solutions that are available to us can make a difference, and that we as claims handlers should be looking for those at the time of any event. Okay, what can help us to get to the point where we can adjust this loss and not ruling anything out?
Jennie, Sarah, thanks so much. It's been great having you on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Dave.
And that concludes this special episode of the Political Risk Podcast, produced in association with Liberty Specialty Markets. And just another reminder that the conversation was recorded a few days before the start of the current conflict in the Gulf. I'd like to thank my two expert guests for this episode, Sarah Howell, Head of First Party Claims, and Jennie Beard, Underwriting Manager for War and Terrorism, both at Liberty Specialty Markets. Until next time, thanks for listening, and please tune in again. I've been your host, David Bennion. Production was by Peter McGill, and my cousin Lawrence Durkin made the music.